Hello, everyone. It's Richard Reeser here, General Secretary of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. I'd like to welcome you to this, our last Module 14 presentation film, Influencing Government. And really, all of what we've done before leads up to this point, because if you can't influence government, you can't actually change the material circumstances of disabled people very much. To help me present this is Sarah Kamau, our acting chair from United Disabled Persons Kenya. We've got recordings of Thandi Mafulu about South Africa from our other one of our vice chairs. We've got Steve Esty from Canada. We've got Professor Michael Stein from Harvard Law Center. We've got Baroness Jane Campbell and representatives of Direct Action Network in the UK, all speaking on this program. So it's full of information. Over to Sarah for the introduction.
Thank you, Richard. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this final module. And we thank you so much for being part of it up to now. I want to introduce it by saying how we should influence government, or how governments have been influenced to be able to accommodate issues of disability. The world and 195 governments have committed to the Sustainable Development Goals with the slogan, "Leave no one behind." And 182 governments have committed to implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities with the slogan of "Nothing about us without us." Yet, progress has been painfully slow towards disability inclusion. Reducing amounts of financial and material aid, increasing international debt, and an ongoing impact of financial inequalities and COVID pandemic are in danger of derailing these ideals. For disabled people, the best way of influence government is to positively improve our position is by building strong grassroots, democratically accountable organizations able to support and hold to account elected representatives who are trained to have an understanding of advocacy at all levels and representing our issues in a clear and achievable way. The opportunities to achieve these goals require power to influence positive outcomes at all levels, from local districts through to regional levels to national and international levels. The clarity of the message and its success will depend on the empowerment of the mass of disabled people in all their diversity. How many disabled people and their diversity in terms of impairment, gender, ethnic diversity, geographical localities, and age range is vital to winning unified policy objectives. The strengths and empowerment of disabled people to implement the improvements in our lives as outlined in the SDGs and UNCRPD depends on how much the social model or the human rights approach has been generalized and forms of organizations developed to influence government.
I think that's it. Right, thanks.
Thank you.
Right, so the center of this is power. What is power? Power to influence government. Well, one definition of power is often defined as the ability to make one's will felt. And here we're talking about the collective will of organizations of disabled people. So we have to come to decide what it is we want to achieve. That's our will. But there are many different sources of power in the world. Wealth power and ownership of assets. We know that the rich and the super rich control most of the world's assets. And that's a real problem. And they're mainly outside of government and outside of the control of government. So they are a real issue to achieve any sort of equality. Democratic power, holding power in an organization or a government because those entitled to vote based on your principles have voted for you. That's both in our organizations at local municipal level, but also at national government level. Autocratic power is an alternative to that, as we've seen in places like Myanmar at the moment, where the police or the army seize power undemocratically and force their views on everybody else, and is the opposite of democracy. Protest power, using peaceful mass means to challenge inequities. And we've seen that with Extinction Rebellion, starting from one young girl in Sweden, moving right through to now having the big climate summits, which are hopefully going to control global warming. There's revolutionary power, uniting a mass of people who feel injustice to take power. And that's really about changing the status quo and moving things on. And certainly what happened in South Africa was a form of revolutionary power where the majority population took over from the minority. But there've been many others, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the English Revolution, all of which have, and the Russian Revolution, all of which have changed the status quo. And disabled people have done better or worse in those situations. Moral and religious power is also something. I mean, when the Pope speaks or the mullahs of the Muslim religion speak, millions of people listen and go by what they say. What they consider right. On the other hand, when the UN speaks, we're talking about the non-religious world, we're talking about the morality of human rights. And that's different worlds collide between these two things. And what the UN does is try and balance these things out. Influencing power. We've seen more and more recently in the last 20 years, prominent people culturally influence thinking through arts, literature, journalism, and the media, celebrity, and social media. So these are all forms of influencing, making one's will felt. So this is the territory in which we as DPOs operate. And we operate on all of these levels to actually try and influence to win our goals. Now, this is Professor Michael Stein from Harvard, and he's going to tell us.
Sessions, there was a working group, sessions, group which included states representatives, NGOs, prominently people with disabilities, and a few academics that came out with draft treaty articles. And from the third ad hoc session through the eighth ad hoc session, what we had were both formal negotiations and informal negotiations. But let's back up a minute and talk about the role of people with disabilities. Until this CRPD was negotiated, the UN treaty had never included the targeted stakeholders as representatives. That's not to say that women were not present during the CEDAW negotiations, they surely were. And that's not to say that children weren't present during the CRC negotiations, they were as well. But the idea of the representative of the targeted group sitting there as NGOs, sitting there as DPOs in our case, and negotiating in the process, that is a first for this UN treaty. And it was motivated by the theme of nothing about us without us. The goal of the international disability rights movement that no one should talk about people with disabilities without including people with disabilities, their input, their wisdom, their lived experiences, so as to come out with the best possible results. This was also enabled by the first ad hoc chair, who is Ambassador Luis Gallegos of Ecuador, who said, well, if we're going to consider whether there should be a disability treaty, we ought to hear from the targeted group as to what their lives are like, why they feel there ought or not to be a treaty, and what they think a treaty ought to include. And so almost by accident, but also by force of will and by the grace of Ambassador Gallegos, people with disabilities were included from the beginning. If we look at the first ad hoc session, we see that 85 people with disabilities were registered to participate in the negotiations. And if we flash forward to the end of the eighth ad hoc session, which was the last substantive negotiation, there was a ninth ad hoc session in which the treaty text was rubber stamped, we see 850 by the end of the eighth ad hoc session. That's quite an increase. And the idea of people with disabilities being part of the negotiations from the beginning was encouraged and supported by Secretary General Kofi Annan, supported and encouraged by the second ad hoc chair, Ambassador Don McKay of New Zealand, and it became expected that people with disabilities would be part and parcel of the negotiations. Now, this happened on two different levels. There was a formal level, so from the third ad hoc session through the eighth, the text of the treaty was cycled through during each of these two-week negotiation sessions, and at the end of every session, the UN works from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6. At the end of each of these daily sessions, a representative from the International Disability Caucus, the IDC, would speak on behalf of people with disabilities, speak with one voice, and say what it was that the international disability community thought about particular provisions. There was also the educative function of people with disabilities speaking during these ad hoc sessions about what their lives were like. And these ranged from very poignant, very moving discussions of what it was like to have been in an institution or a psychiatric hospital, what it was like to have seen people who never left these psychiatric institutions and spent their lives imprisoned indoors, to more lighthearted but very pointed discussions. I think my favorite was that by Robert Martin of New Zealand, someone who has an intellectual disability and who comes from a very progressive country, who talked about what it was like not to have been able to own a bank account and to be able to handle his own finances until he was well into adulthood. And he sort of scratched his head and he said, you know, I don't understand because I'm sitting here in the United States and there's this company called Enron that's lost $3 billion. None of them have intellectual disabilities. And yet I've never written a bad check in my life. I've never lost money. Why is it that because I had an intellectual disability, it was assumed that I couldn't handle my finances? But here you have people without intellectual disabilities, with advanced degrees, losing billions of dollars, and that's considered just fine. This was a very important function. Most of these states' representatives, although they were very open to the idea of a disability treaty, come from elite and privileged backgrounds, often come from countries where people with disabilities are not visible. They're not seen on the streets, they're not seen as part of society, and the idea that on an everyday basis during these negotiations, the state representatives interacted with people with disabilities, saw them, communicated with them, had to interact with them, received briefing notes from them, were lobbied by them for different provisions, were educated by them as to the disability community's positions on various provisions. This was enormously useful, and it's reflected in the ultimate text of the document. In fact, if we were to look at Article 4, we would see that there is a general obligation on behalf of states to actively consult with and interact and heed the advice of their civil society groups, and in particular, those with disabilities. We see in the monitoring provisions that states' representatives and states' parties must interact with, seek the advice, and utilize and cooperate with DPOs, disabled people's organizations at the local level. This idea of nothing about us without us, of disabled persons being able to speak to what their lived experiences are like, what their priorities are, what their needs are, permeates the convention and permeates its implementation. And so that was enormously important. Sessions.
Okay, so just to underline that point, quoting from the convention 4.3, and this is something that all disability activists should have at their fingertips. In the development and implementation of legislation policy to implement the present convention and in other decision-making processes concerning issues relating to persons with disabilities, state parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities through their representative organizations, not NGOs, which are not run and controlled by disabled people. Yet most governments are talking to the NGOs rather than the DPOs. And this is one of the fundamental problems about implementation currently. Secondly, in the monitoring, Article 33, there's other points there about a focal point within the government and an independent human rights organization to check it. But the third leg of the stool, if you like, is civil society, in particular persons with disabilities and their representative organizations shall be involved and participate fully in the monitoring process. So that's where we're meant to be. So ways of influencing government. Well, set up consultative forums with government for regular meetings is a really good point. but not to be sidelined. They need to have important people from government there so you can actually influence them. Getting key disability activists co-opted into the work of government is something people have aimed at, but be careful that those activists don't go, if you like, turn over to being just government spokespeople. They're there to represent the disability movement, and so need to be under monitoring and control by the people who put them there. Disability equality training led by disabled people to ministers, civil servants, officers and managers so they actually understand the paradigm shift and what it means. Creating reports, charters or shadow legislation and publicizing it. This is something we do ourselves as DPOs. Writing motions, speaking to trade unions, political parties, civil society branches to get them to support that, which is about building up the weight of the argument to persuade government. Writing and collecting signatures for mass petitions, where we have to have the arguments with people wherever they are. Lobbying, targeted meetings with ministers and members of parliament. Demonstrations, which can include hunger strikes, occupations, to publicize our demands, stopping the traffic, as we'll see a bit later on. Having representative disabled members in parliament, provided that they are actually representing us and not representing themselves. Disabled activists put pro-disability rights policies to get support from unions and other campaigns. Through media, writing letters to the press, TV and radio, getting interviews, getting programs made. Social media through Facebook, Twitter to highlight injustices, and persuading media to make programs on disability issues. These are all ways of exercising our power as civil society organizations, the DPOs, to persuade and influence government. Here's an example then from Canada, from Steve, how that actually worked.
Hi, Steve.
Here's Steve.
Hi there, my name is Steve Esty and I'm from Canada. I'm on the board of directors of CDPF and have been since it was founded originally some 10 years ago or so. Richard has asked me to speak briefly about influencing government, and I just wanted to share some experience that we've had here in Canada about that. I retired from a position as the national coordinator of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities a year ago this May. And the last main project that I did was around influencing the government to improve legislation that had been enacted or was to be enacted around creating a national accessibility structure in Canada. We had a new government elected here in 2015, and one of the key campaign promises that the government made was to enact accessibility legislation. So what happened after the election was they embarked on a series of consultations across the country with disabled people to find out what it was they thought accessibility legislation should look like. They met in capital cities in every province in Canada. There were 10 provinces across the country from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. They met in all 10 cities with probably groups of about 100 or 150 disabled people, heard what people wanted the legislation to look like. Then, with that information, government took the process internal, and their lawyers and policy people drafted legislation, which was introduced into our House of Commons in 2018. And at that point in time, the national disability community really began to engage because the legislation that was introduced in 2018 was really a pale shadow of what we had hoped it would be during the consultation process in 2016, 2017. That's very often the case, you know. So what happened was there's a committee process that unfolded over the course of a couple of months in Ottawa, and disabled people and organizations from across the country went to Ottawa to talk with legislators about what we felt needed to be improved in the legislation. We talked informal committee processes, but we also talked many informal processes in the hallways of the House of Commons, over lunches and dinners, and even the odd drink, if you really want to know. And we had some effect on improving the legislation, but it wasn't still at the point that we thought it should be. But it went back to the House of Commons, and there were some improvements made. And then it went to the Senate, which is the final stage in the legislative drafting process here in Canada. And in the Senate, the senators are more independent of political parties than they are in the House than members of the House of Commons are. So we put a lot of energy into working with the Senate, and we had real success in terms of improving the legislation with the Senate, and the senators really listened to and acted upon the advice that we gave in the Senate hearings. And the Senate made several key improvements, and it went back from the Senate to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons listened to the Senate, I'm happy to say. And what we saw was that through this sort of two-stage process, we were really able to, as a national disability community, have quite a significant impact in terms of improving the legislation, so that finally, when the legislation was enacted, in 2019, it was really much better than it was when it had been brought back to the House of Commons earlier that year. So that's a process that we used, and I hope that that's useful information for you.
So the Accessible Canada Act bill, which Steve was talking about there, it started in June 2018, the minister introducing it, and the bill was created. We've heard about the consultative mechanisms and DPO involvement. One of the purposes of the Act was to prevent accessibility barriers in information and communication technologies, including digital content and technologies used to access it. Requirements of the Act include web accessibility following the WCAG guidance, and if companies don't do it, there's a fine of $250,000 Canadian dollars. So that's really powerful. On the 21st of June, the Accessible Canada Act became law, and then each 10 provinces enacted their own versions of it. And this is really important, that this type of activity leads to legislation which then change things. And then, of course, our job is to monitor it and make sure that government is actually implemented, because, of course, the statute book is littered with legislation that's been passed but is not enacted. So here we are going to go on to hearing from the Pacific and how...
Our next speaker, Ms. Angeline Chand, who is the team leader of the programs for the Pacific Disability.
Just get this start.
Of the Pacific Disability Forum. Is that better?
We can hear you, but it's very faint.
Oh dear. Greetings from the Pacific Disability Forum. Is that better?
Thank you so much. You can shout as loud as you like.
Thank you. Greetings from the Pacific Disability Forum. It's a pleasure to be in this webinar highlighting the voices of the Pacific. But firstly, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for your very rich insight to the various topics. For the Pacific Disability Forum, prior to COVID-19, we already had a Pacific Emergency Response Unit, which meant that we had already established partnerships with organizations to deal with natural disasters and climate change. So with COVID-19, we were able to get into that platform again, working with the different cluster groups such as on food security, livelihoods, education, health, the subcluster on gender-based violence. Serving on these different cluster groups allowed us the opportunity to promote the twin track approach, because the cluster groups are made up of government representatives, donor partners, NGOs, and the civil society. So it's about promoting disability inclusion, how they could better include persons with disabilities in whatever interventions they were doing. And we were also reminding the different partners of the cluster groups when they are working at the national level to ensure the voices of National Disabled People's Organization. We've also worked on core documents that has been shared to our partners to help them for their inclusion of the persons with disabilities in their different programs. And we have also developed messaging that organizations could use. And as our colleague from Samoa highlighted, most of the governments are promoting the use of sign language during national news, and they are also paying for sign language interpreters. We are also working on easy to read versions of the core documents, and we have also partnered with UNFPA. As we know that UNFPA in times of emergencies distributes dignity kits to women, so they have come to us in this COVID period to request women with disabilities to assess those dignity kits to ensure what else in addition to their normal dignity kits would be useful and vital for women with disabilities. Once that list is finalized, once the kits are available, it will be distributed to women and girls with disabilities.
So I think what's important about Angeline's contribution there is because the Pacific Disability Forum, based in Fiji and covering 14 of our member organizations, is well organized, and they had structures in place before COVID. They were much more able to actually interact with governments and to get funding from regional funders, particularly DFAT from Australia, to actually develop a good strategy to deal with COVID. Now, as it happens, there's been hardly any infections in that part of the world, but nevertheless, they had a really good plan. Going back in history now to the UK, we got to a point where after many attempts to pass anti-discrimination legislation, we were stuck. And so a group of disabled people, Direct Action Network, decided that the only way that this was going to change, government kept wasting time when the bill came up. There was a majority in Parliament, but the Conservative government of the time wouldn't let it be put to the vote. So Direct Action, which was filmed on television, was what changed this.
Other people are inconvenienced.
I'm inconvenienced every day of my
because
In 1995, disabled activists brought central London to a standstill.
Unless you fight for your rights, you lose them. You've got to keep going.
Fighting for equality. Sorry, this is the problem with fiddling around with films.
Unless you fight for your rights, you lose them. You've got to keep going.
Fighting for equality.
I want to be able to go nightclubbing, I want to go to restaurants, I want to go to the cinema without being a fire risk.
They targeted a public transport system that was inaccessible.
Changing ourselves to buses was something we just simply had to do. There'd be somebody at the front of the bus, there'd be somebody at the back and somebody underneath.
what have you done to the bus?
I've just chained myself to it with a handcuff.
You're not going to get any sympathy doing this.
Listen, we're not interested in your sympathy. All we want is to be able to get on the bus the same as every other member of the public.
You want to get on the bus, get on the bus.
How?
This is stupid, like one in front.
How? I'm getting that. Oh, dragging me up the stairs. He's got another thing coming.
It was important to go to the heart of government. It always is. In the end, we were saying that we want a law that protects our rights. We had nothing.
Hi guys.
gathered together some of the activists involved, and this is 25 years after it, so in 2020. Let's hear what they have to say.
That was iconic then, and it's still iconic now. I just thought it was like a really significant moment.
I was amazed. I do remember it just made me, it was making me well up with absolute pride.
Time disabled people had
by doing this kind of stuff, it meant that we got attention to the issue. If other ways had worked, we wouldn't have needed to do that. You know, if people had just kind of, you know, had some common sense and included it into society, then we wouldn't have had to do any of this stuff.
I'm getting unapologetically emotional now. We absolutely need disabled people to be free, and that is why we need it to keep going.
How much impact can protest have?
How many times did you get arrested?
I got arrested 8 times. What
I
about you?
lost count. 25 years on, I think disabled people are in a better situation in some circumstances than we were. If you look at the design of that bus now, there is no point at which to handcuff yourself. But disabled people's rights aren't fully protected.
By being handcuffed to a train, other people were delayed, other people were inconvenienced.
I'm inconvenienced every day of my
because
life. We achieved something significant, but it hasn't gone far enough. So we're still fighting for better legislation.
A hell of a lot of disabled people live in poverty because of the way that we treat disabled people as a society. So we're not finished, not by a long way.
We're kicking up some fuss, and we will keep on marching till you let us off the bus.
Okay, so what happened in the UK? Well, 1995 Discrimination Act, after that direct action and filibustering on the 7th attempt, it was passed in November. But it did not include education applied to businesses only with more than 20 employees. The Labour government elected a couple of years later had a manifesto commitment due to lobbying by DPOs to strengthen the act. In 2001, under the Labour government, an act was passed to include all educational establishments. In 2005, the Disability Act had 150 strengthening amendments, including the public duty to promote disability equality. In 2010, this was replaced by the Equality Act, which broadened the numbers of people who were covered, but actually weakened the disability provisions. In 2012, the Tory government, elected in 2010, declares war on benefit cheats, massive negative impact on disabled people. And in 2016, the United Nations criticizes the UK for systematic and catastrophic abuse of human rights. And in 2021, over 60% of deaf and disabled people died from, of those who died from COVID were deaf and disabled people. So the attack on the infrastructure, which took place over the previous 10 years by the Tory government, and the sidelining of disabled people's organisations, has actually led to an increased death toll in disabled people. As Baroness Jane Campbell, who was one of the leaders of this movement and has been in the House of Lords as a champion, says, short little piece.
20 years ago, I stood outside of Parliament and felt the happiest girl in the world because I believed I was going to get civil rights in my life. 20 years on, I've become really jaded and sad that actually not only are our rights not being implemented and enforced in the way that we envisaged that day, but I'm sad because people out there who can make our lives a whole lot better by implementing the act are ignoring it. And that makes me feel personally very sad. And I guess a bit insulted.
So the fight has continued over this previous period. New forms of developed of action. Disabled people against the cuts carry out on the fight against austerity and the terrible toll on the lives of disabled people. There are posters here of their demonstrations. Dead people can't claim. Paul Reek suffered severe depression, found fit for work by Atos, the private company the government put to administer disability benefits. His benefit was stopped and he committed suicide. He's one of at least 800, though many of the activists think there are many more than that. The government have admitted 750 deaths because of these cuts to people. So this has been actually a serious attack on disabled people, as the UN has said, and disabled people continue to resist it. And it's all about power. In the financial crisis and so on, who is attacked, having established good benefit systems, the weakest link. And so the price of democracy and for our livelihoods is eternal vigilance and strong disabled people's organizations. Now over to Sarah, who's going to tell us something about how the United Disabled Persons of Kenya came about and how they influenced government there.
Thank you, Richard. I'll talk about the UDPK, which is an United Disabled Persons of Kenya, an umbrella organization of persons with disabilities in Kenya.
Sorry.
Thanks, Richard. It was established and registered in 1989 under Section 10 of the Societies Act by the Registrar of Society. UDPK is the reference civil society organization for persons with disabilities in Kenya. And the organization exists to advocate for equal access to opportunities and to active participation of persons with disabilities in mainstream development processes. UDPK has a mandate which is to play a critical role in advocating for the inclusion of persons with disabilities during the formulation of 2010 Constitution. It played a very key role in ensuring that issues of disability were included during the Constitution formulation. UDPK has also continued to ensure that laws and policies developed are inclusive, as well as ensuring meaningful participation of persons with disabilities in governance processes. Some examples of the laws that have been influenced include: one, the Persons with Disability Act of 2003, which paved the way for the establishment of a National Council for Persons with Disabilities. And this is a government parastatal that coordinates service delivery to persons with disabilities within the country. It also has influenced closely the process to enact the Persons with Disability Act 2020, which has been reviewed in line with the UNCRPD, which once it comes to force, it will repeal the earlier Act of 2003. And this has been done with a lot of support from DPOs who have given their inputs, and UDPK has submitted the same to the government agencies to be able to include them. There's also the Elections Act that was heavily influenced also by the organization, which allowed or saw many persons with disabilities now going into government positions, being elected and being even nominated to represent persons with disabilities in the local counties and even at national level. UDPK played a very key role in ensuring that persons with disabilities are now decision makers, even when it comes to policy making organs like the assembly, the county assembly, and the national assemblies. UDPK has also worked closely with the Directorate of Special Needs Education on sector policy for learners with disabilities. On this policy, UDPK participated by giving input into the policy, and during its launch, which was done by the President of Kenya in 2018. And this has been used now to ensure inclusive education in schools, and even ensuring that people with disabilities are taken care of. Their needs are part of what happens in the inclusive setup that is coming out now. UDPK has also played a role in negotiating the formulation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Kenya ratified in 2008, and it has lobbied to include this framework in the Constitution of Kenya and subsequent implementation policy and legislative frameworks around the UNCRPD. It has also involved and supported forums on the review of the social protection policy. These forums for the protection policy have been organized by the Social Protection Actors Forum in Kenya. And all these have brought about positive impacts in the way policies have been made in Kenya to include persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I well remember comrades from both Kenya, Uganda and South Africa who were the main voices of disabled people when we were making the convention, and particularly also from Uganda, James Mwanda, who was the founder of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. So there's a direct link from the links that were made between us as we were making the convention and the setting up of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum in 2008. Another organization that was represented there at the beginning when we set that up was the NCPEDP and Jabir Abidi, and his vision was to not only have an organization that fought for employment rights for disabled people in India, but to actually set up a disability network that was cross-disability rights movement equally across the entire country, and there is an environment of empathy towards disabled people, was their mission. And they brought together and now have representations in 36 territories and states across India. Objectives were to promote local advocacy groups and build leadership, the disability sector, to facilitate local advocacy groups to join hands with the state level groups to eventually form national network, which they have, from village to block, district, state, national, regarding persons with disabilities, to empower disabled people and organizations to sensitize other concerns through sector information, to closely monitor and lobby with government and cooperate other allied sectors and advocate the adoption and implementation of appropriate policies, to bring issues related to disability to the forefront of the national development through a network and representatives from all territories, and to build a common cross-disability platform for sharing our concerns. And this issue of cross-disability is really important. Yes, we've had blind and deaf organizations for 120 years, but that hasn't actually progressed things for other disabled people who are in the majority. And until we have cross-impairment organizations which represent all and are accessible to all, we can't really move forward. And so that was one of the models of the National Disability Network in India. And it was put in practice in their 7-year struggle for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, to incorporate the UNCRPD into Indian legislation. And the bill finally, after a working group that started 5 years before, defined for the first time the meaning of disability for 21 different categories of impairments. Based on vital amendments, the bill for the first time represented rights-based legislation. It focused on transforming the meaning of disability, expanding its definition from existing medical to a social one. And the amendment included hiking the quota for government jobs up from 3 to 5%, and putting measures in place for the private sector, and also putting in place commissioners in each state who had the power to actually challenge judicially what was going on, discrimination. And here we have a picture of people outside the Parliament, one of many demonstrations that were organized by the network to actually get the Indian government to finally agree this, the cabinet on the 16th of December, and the law became law on the last day really of December 2016. There's still problems with implementation, but nevertheless, huge work done by DPOs there in India. And that's what we have to keep going at. Now, another opportunity for us is the Sustainable Development Goals. We've been talking about UN CRPD, but the Sustainable Development Goals also provide an opportunity for us to lobby governments for them to take part in the voluntary reviews and then go to the higher level political forum that meets every July in New York or online this year. And we have, in order, if countries agree to that and we can pressure them to do it, then we can advocate the national level, but we can also advocate at regional meetings they have to hold if they agree to that with UN support, and then go as representatives to the forum at the global level and put our own views. So this is an important way of doing it. And these are some of the ways that we can do it. The review process is voluntary, and therefore we have to urge governments to actually be part of the review process. Each year is a different theme, but it also covers the whole range of implementing the goals. When member states are willing to report, they must designate a focal point, and they must hold national consultations with civil society. And that's where we can come in and really push our agendas. As the voluntary national reporting is a process, the UN has developed support for member states to do this. So that's an important resource. Between the period from when a country volunteers and the higher level political forum takes place, there are numerous national, regional, and local meetings where, again, we can get our positions across. The government reports at the high level political forum, which has themes each year, and major groups and other stakeholders have the opportunity to present joint statements to ask questions of member states. So this is a real scrutiny process held in the world view and recorded by the UN. So we can gain a great deal by doing this. But all of it will only work if we have built up strong, effective grassroots organizations to push the policies that we want. But we can also hold side events and breakfasts when we're at the UN with people. Now, perhaps one of the biggest challenges for disabled people was in the apartheid years in South Africa, and Thandi Mafulu, our vice chair, is going to tell us a little bit about that.
They call it the Coordinating Committee on Disability, like a task team, interdepartmental content. But it was just to advise the government and policies and respond on policies that are there. But how they go about it, it's about charity. Instead of us talking, it was them telling us what needs to happen and all those things. So, in terms of the constitution, we said, okay, Section 9 of the Constitution should be inclusive of people with disability, because we pick up that we cannot do that. That's how it started. So that we can protect people with disability against discriminations on the ground of disability, against all forms of discrimination. Because we were saying, as people with disability, whether you were white or you were black, the discrimination was the same. There was no difference under the apartheid. So we had to stick together. 1984, that's when DPSA was formed in South Africa. You know, the reason why we had to do that, we rejected the entire choice, the initiative done by the government, because we felt that the apartheid system was not promoting equality. It was also not promoting equalization of opportunity, and it was not also principle to the world programs of action. And we did not also believe that apartheid did promote equality when it was based on inequality, on the principle. Thus, that was the contradiction between DPSA and the government during that program. And then DPSA raised opposition to the apartheid government. And we said, we also highlighted that there's between violence, poverty, in the apartheid system. Remember those years, people were, taken to and fro. So there was this system that makes it difficult to agree with them.
Yeah.
And then we recognize that as TPSA, we need to engage strategically with the government to try and ensure that programs that become more relevant to disabled people will be guaranteed some say in the formulating of policy. So we agreed in principle to participate in the 1986 South African Year of Disabled, so that we can start to receive grants from government. Remember, we're not receiving any financial injections or financial grant from government. But DPSA, we rejected this purely because that we felt that the apartheid system was not in a good space to be able to assist people with disability based on discrimination, inequality, and all those things. So we rejected it. And then we said, instead of taking money openly, we should say that money, there's no strings attached. If they give us money as government, there's no strings attached. They're not going to tell us what to do, where we should belong or where we should not belong. And then by that, the government did not give DPSA money. And then under the apartheid government, as disabled people, we also experience a lot of discrimination, unequal society, deeply divided society, because amongst ourselves as disabled people, we were mixed. We were talking with one voice, black and white. But inside that talking with one voice, there was also this deeply divided, unequal society. Starting from political, economic, social system. And we have to be, Black people have to be subservient to white people, where they were denied Black basic rights. And as disabled people, we felt it as Black disabled people. So that's how we started. Then we came to the new government, where we insisted to participate. First of all, as DPSA, we went and approached the political party, which is ANC. We went and approached them and sat with them and said, for us to be recognized as human beings, this is how we are going to support. But this is what we demand from you as the incoming political party. That was 1992. We are going to wait for you. You must agree, then we can participate. That's how we started to participate. If you can look, there's an act that is called the Reconstruction and Development Act, the RDP Act. When you go into that act, you'll find that issues of disability are captured in the act. Everything that we wanted is captured there. Then they took it from that act and put it into the Constitution, because we said we need to be equal society. And that's how we came in. And it was very, very powerful. It was working well, because once a year, we will meet with the president of the country, which was then Mr. Mandela. And then after that, it became Mr. Thabo Mbeki, where we had this relationship that was very good, because now once a year, we come and sit and check, are we on the right track? What is happening? And we became honest with each other. Those workshops used to be 3 days. Honest workshops where we say, but here you are missing, here you are not missing, and all those things. And here you are doing well. And we started to have members of parliament. We started to have people on board. We started to have people on higher position. People with disability were, they were doing well. We were starting now to see that we are moving as disabled people. But when the new era of President Zuma, I'm not just saying he's bad, when he came in, things started to fall apart. We knew that we don't have to make an appointment to see the president. We will ask for him, he will come. Or he'll ask for us, we will go. But after that, things started to fall flat. Issues of disability started to deteriorate. race started to come in again, and it never used to be there among ourselves as Black people and white disabled people. And it started now, companies, when they will support white organization, they won't support Black organization. And then it started to become a splinter, where some white organization members would get out of DPSA because they want to form their own. But what we picked up, we've realized that they've seen that there's money in disability. So they use it as their way of making money.
Right.
We need to talk as disabled.
Okay, we'll move on. We're running out of time. Sarah's going to round up on this slide, and I'll round up on the next one, and then I think we've done. Sarah, concluding remarks.
Richard. On concluding remarks on influencing government, for us to be able to influence government, effectively, national DPOs need to strive to first have democratic consultative mechanisms to ensure that they are representing the views of their entire membership. They also have to have ongoing trainings and awareness raising available to their members so that they can understand what they're influencing the governments on. They should have democratic structures with leaders regularly elected. They should also publicize by having regular bulletins or newsletters to keep their members informed of what is going on. And they should ensure proceedings and publications are available in different accessible modes to meet members' needs.
Okay, thank you. And then
thank you.
We would expect from the government, because after all, those 182 governments, including 51 of the 54 Commonwealth countries have signed up to this, that they would actually work to develop the representative organizations, the voice of disabled people. So this means setting up a timetable for implementation of legislation and measures to implement the UNCRPD and the SDG and to monitor these. Regularly gather disaggregated data based on the Washington Group framework. Set up regular meetings with representatives of DPOs. Ensure DPOs have sufficient funding to function as representative organizations. And this is something that in many countries isn't happening. How can you consult with representative organizations if those organizations cannot function because they have no funding to have an office, to have provide the accessible communications and the consultations with their members? So there's a duty on government from 4.3 and 33.3 to actually fund DPOs. Make information available to all disabled people on the progress of implementing disability rights. This is something the government needs to do. It's part of Article 8, awareness raising. And ensure that disabled people are members of parliament and senior civil servants. So they need to find some ways of getting the voice of disabled people into their legislature. Ensure ministers are under regular scrutiny, including taking account of DPO's views. And promote disability equality and inclusive development in all of their policies, because this is what they've signed up to. So we can see that how government respond to their requirements under the SDGs and the UNCRPD, they need us as organized DPOs. They may not like us all the time because we ask awkward questions, but they need to also facilitate us to do that process, because after all, we are representing between 15 to 20% of the population, more with older people, and they need to take account of what we're saying. And this would include, under the UNCRPD General Comment number 7, families of disabled people where they cannot represent their views themselves. Though we would always support, as the as the Commonwealth Disabled Peoples Forum, wherever possible, the development of self-advocacy amongst people with autism, learning difficulties, mental health issues, or dementia. So that's where we are, but we think it's really important that we go forward from this course, for those of you who've been on it, to take these ideas back into your local areas and build your DPOs to have the strength we've demonstrated can actually lead to results. So I'd like to thank everybody for supporting this event, and particularly to Sina and to Gemma and Sarah for that. Thank you very much, and goodbye.